Well, hello. Ooh, kind of loud. Scared me. My name is Bradley Bartz. I'm here with Mark Van Elk and we're going to discuss Windows Azure Pack. We'll give you just a brief overview of what is this thing that you keep hearing about called Windows Azure Pack, and why are we doing this. But beyond that, we'll get into some real-world experiences about what's happening in actual deployments and how is this being used in real life. And that's where Mark's going to give us these deep insights. So that's the idea. We'll give you an introduction into the platform, Windows Azure Pack, the designs of the platform. Fundamentally, this is a project that's centered around this transformation of the data center. Now, that's not just about the transformation of our partner data centers. It's also about the transformation of the Azure data centers, the Microsoft data centers, about delivering a modern data center for app mobility, for modern agile applications and user scenarios, for big data scenarios, for cloud on-demand scale with real-time performance, infrastructure designed and withstand failure, resource managed at data center scales. Our solution, the Microsoft strategy, is one that says we're going to provide a cloud platform that our partners and customers can rely on, regardless of the data center they choose to deploy their applications and services in. Sure, we'd love it if you bring all your applications and all your workloads to Microsoft's Azure public cloud. But we realize that may not be appropriate for every workload and every customer. So what's the alternative? The alternative is to start providing our cloud technologies, our platform, our solutions into partner data centers, whether it be for a hosting service provider or the enterprise. That's what we mean by Cloud OS, this consistent cloud platform that can run in partner data centers that customers, the cloud consumer, the application developers, the line of business operators can deploy their applications to with confidence. So our envision, this consistent cloud platform, the diagram on the left is exactly what we're referring there, where one, the customer, that's the data center in your organization, Microsoft's, the public cloud data center, and the service provider data center, delivering this consistent cloud platform that can run in any of these data centers to enable modern business applications, empower people-centric IT, unlock insights on any data. That is the transformation of the data center. Ultimately delivering the Office 365, Xbox Live, Bing. We're taking the learnings. It's one thing to aspire to build a great cloud platform. It's a whole nother thing to actually deliver it, take the live site issues that happen, and maintain a cloud 24/7 in production. Well, we're doing that. We're learning a ton of information from our Microsoft Azure investments and running production applications there, and we're taking those learnings, the hardening of the cloud platform, and bringing that into our partner data centers for running their workloads. At the end of the day, it is to deliver these high-performance storage and industry-standard hardware, multi-tenanted environments with isolation, software-defined networking, policy-based automation, and application elasticity. Now, it's worth noting this is a journey. This is the vision and aspiration of where we're going. The Windows Azure Pack is our first installment on this journey. Did we get there in the first release? No. You'll see some of that when Mark goes through the details and uncovers some of the nuts and bolts and real-world experiences. But make no doubt about it, this is the path we're on. We're on the path of rationalizing our cloud technologies in the public cloud, in the private cloud, in the hosted cloud for this consistent cloud platform. And it's worth noting, Azure is designed for hyperscale, cloud across the globe. Not every partner's data center has those exact needs. They're a little smaller in scale for what they need to support, but they still need to support scale, elasticity, robustness, and still have an ability to go cross cloud even. So this is the direction. We're working on these capabilities. Now, as we've met with partners, we found out that enterprises are very interested in cloud and have a lot of the same interests as service providers. But what do enterprises specifically want? They want a flexible cloud with familiar technologies and no vendor lock-in. Enterprises want to be able to make choices about what clouds they use and consume, but they want that technology in their own data center. They are interested in multi-tenanted clouds, preferably as easy to use as Azure. There's a phenomenon going on in IT called rogue IT, where you have all these developers and agile groups going, kind of bypassing IT and going out to third-party external clouds, moving production workloads that aren't really supposed to be running in those external clouds offsite. Well, how do they bring that under the control and back under governance? How can an IT organization provide those kind of agile, elastic, on-demand capabilities that the service provider is doing? Or hosting providers also need chargeback. What is chargeback? The ability to monetize, to account for the resources that are running in your data center. Now, a hosting provider, they'll do that with a credit card. You'll know. You'll get the bill. What happens in an enterprise? Well, enterprise IT organizations still need to account for resources being used by different organizations within the broader org. That's known as chargeback. Can they do that for cloud services? And what does that mean? They want these simple automated operations. Automation is a key tenet in any data center. More effective utilization of existing hardware and assets. At the end of the day, IT budgets are often constrained. I need to be able to do this either on existing hardware or be able to incrementally grow as I bring new hardware into the data center. I want to have tenant choice. This is this idea of providing dynamic resources available to my customers, to an IT organization's customers that come in for the services they consume. At the end of the day, again, I need to be able to create, as an IT organization, commodity offers I might do for some of my customers who might be needing just, it may not be a line of business application, it may be a dev team that is doing this for some dev test scenarios or some scenarios where they don't need a production deployment. I need to have clouds like that. I also need my production clouds where I can run my line of business applications that are critical to the business and should never go down. All integrated with line of business. Now, when we look at hosting service providers, what are they asking us for? One, they want to win more enterprise business. So they're also attracting the enterprise, but they want to provide that value add, that external cloud to the enterprise. They're looking at multi-tenanted services for self-service IaaS and PaaS offerings. They do want to do usage chargeback, but with a real chargeback against your credit card. They want to actually do customer billing. The same data that drives a chargeback solution and a billing solution is the same meters, the same usage meters. So both hosting providers and enterprise want that same access of data. Hosting service providers, they want extreme automation. They want to automate everything. Because every person they put in supporting the cloud, their value proposition goes down. It's costing, they're losing money. The more they can automate, their margins increase. So automation is a big deal. They're very interested in that hardware monetization, optimized hardware. One thing that a hosting service provider wants to do that enterprises don't typically want to do is they want to upsell you. Every time you go in to use the site, oh, have you thought about a new certificate? Do you need more? How about another domain name? Oh, have you think about more storage? How about this capability? Service providers are always interested in the upsell opportunities, slightly different. Enterprise, not so much. But hosting service providers also need to create differentiated offers from public clouds. How do they differentiate themselves? Do value-add offers? It may be through SLA offerings, through different kinds of hardware configurations and different deployments, but at the end of the day, they still want to provide some of the attributes of the public cloud. And again, finally, service providers need to be able to brand and own their customer relationship and identity and understand that the business that they're operating. Well, when we look at this, we find a set of common requirements. Both service providers and the enterprise want an enterprise-friendly solution. Enterprises for their own purposes and for service providers to attract enterprises. They both need multi-tenanted IaaS, preferably something as easy as what Azure has become. They're both interested in the usage metrics so they can create custom billing solutions as appropriate to their business. Automation, big deal. Both data centers need automation. They both are interested in hardware utilization and maximizing that. They both want to offer their tenants choice. They both want to create unique offers. I may create in the enterprise one offer for my DevOps team. I may create another offer type for the marketing or line of business team. I may create unique offers, create different pools of resources that are used to address the needs of different customers within my organization. Service providers are used to doing that and doing that all the time. All right. So with that in mind, let's take a look at the approach we took with Windows Azure Pack. This is a marketecture. This is a high-level abstraction of what Azure looks like. There's the Azure Fabric, the blue cloud, that's delivering compute, storage, and networking. On that, we run a bunch of services. These services expose functionality. We aggregate all that functionality through a common API. We layer on a management portal that can talk to that management API. Our customers can come in and access the portal or API from the public and access that. From an administrative standpoint, we have the Azure IT groups and product groups are actually maintaining the services on the back end. And that's at a very high level, kind of the Azure abstraction of things. When we looked at how to provide this technology inside partner data centers, both the enterprise and with service providers, instead of the Azure Fabric, we realized we actually have very good technologies in partner data centers today. Technologies that are evolving and providing a lot of capability from Windows Server and System Center. So the question is, let's partner with our technology assets that are going into partner data centers to make them more cloud aware, more Azure aware. Take the learnings that we're getting from Azure and funnel those back into Windows Server and System Center. Then, on top of that, let's start building out the same kind of multi-tenanted infrastructure that we built out for Azure. That is, we'll run a set of these services, these customer-facing services on top of that fabric. We'll take that tenant and portal and API. These are the same source code assets, the same hardened assets that we deploy and operate in Azure. Let's take those, package them up, make those deployable in our partner data centers so that their customers, and IT's customers, or a service provider's customers can log in and get a comparable experience that they would have gotten had they actually gone to Azure. But we needed to do more than that. We had to extend it. We had to create an operator view. Now, how do we run Azure? We have a lot of very complicated PowerShell scripts, and a lot of people run those PowerShell scripts all the time and are moving workloads and monitoring and diagnostics. It's not exactly a turnkey, friendly, easy-to-use management experience. We realized that would be very difficult to ship into partner data centers. So we needed to create an abstraction. We needed to create more general-purposed experience for managing the set of offers we want to create. So we extended the multi-tenanted experience for customers and created a multi-tenanted administrative experience where I can manage the resource clouds that I'm making available to my tenants, where I can automate the services that are running in my back end, that I can do billing integration and work with third-party billing and chargeback solutions, where I can basically manage the tenants that are coming in and consuming resources. And then there's this concept of a hosting plan, but it's basically the way of aggregating a set of resources that I have in my data center that I want to make available to a tenant. Because whenever a tenant comes in, it's a cloud. They actually get a subscription to the cloud, even if it's on-prem or with a service provider. They still have that cloud access model, and that is based on how an operator defines that model through the administrative experience. And that's in there, called hosting plans. That layer sitting on top between tenant portal, admin portal, tenant APIs, admin APIs, the services, the billing, the automation, third-party integration, that gray box wrapping the two sets of blue boxes, that's the Windows Azure Pack. That's what's made available as the Windows Azure Pack for deployment in partner data centers to build out a Azure-like experience within their data center. Ultimately, it's about delivering these customer-ready, self-service experiences from a self-hosted environment. For websites, virtual machines, service bus, virtual networks, and database, for example, you can provision databases in IaaS, but you can also do database as a service on a SQL cluster. These kind of capabilities are integrated into Windows Azure Pack for delivering those services to your customers. Finally, it's about delivering a solution that is just as applicable for the service provider as it is for the enterprise as we move to start delivering agile cloud services to this cloud consumer, these customers. They have a common set of needs for production applications. They want to have familiar technology that they can use regardless of the cloud they go to, with virtualized management tools, a variety of infrastructure in the back end. That's Windows Azure Pack at a high level. It's about this journey we're on of creating a consistent cloud experience, one that we can operate and the one that you can operate in your data centers. And with that, I'm going to actually turn it over to Mark now to peel back the covers and tell you what's really going on now, below the marketing, below the kind of high-level value prop, and give you some of the details.
Thanks, Bradley. Everybody give Bradley a hand. Since the initial release of Windows Azure Services for Windows Server, which is the predecessor of Windows Azure Pack, I've been working with enterprise organizations and service providers implementing this Cloud OS. Now, at first sight, you might think that these two types of organizations are rather different. We have, for instance, the service provider. When you think of a service provider, what would be the key components that you would focus on from an IT perspective? Would that be the hypervisor? Would that be management? Would that be automation, like in a picture? Or even usage and billing? Probably all of those. On the other end, the enterprise organization, they're traditionally designed around departments. And all these departments have their own responsibilities. Let's say you request a virtual machine in an enterprise organization. And I've been there, trust me, I know. It will take weeks. Because we have the networking department. That's that guy in the back with the bolts. He's requesting an IP address within his Excel sheet or maybe even IPAN. Then we have another guy, which is the security department. And the security department will generate you a computer object. It will pre-stage it for you. So you're already 2 days gone. Then in the front, those guys with their arms all over the engine. The Windows department, which will actually implement the operating system. And we have the development, which will actually install the application. But then again, after 6 weeks, you'll have a highly customized virtual machine, and you're off. So the interesting thing is, for enterprise organizations, specifically top-down, what are the key components that these types of organizations are focusing on? These are the same types of components. These are virtualization, virtualize everything, and automation, very important, self-service, and like Brad said, even usage and billing. And these two types of organization come from a different standpoint, true, but they're working towards the same goal. And Windows Azure Pack is an awesome solution that will take those two types of organization to that goal. There are many moving parts in the Cloud OS solution. It's not only Windows Azure Pack, it's the whole framework that goes down in the infrastructure as well. So there are many parts that you'll end up with. Where do I place certain solutions? Where do I place them in my environment? What choices do I have? And what challenges will you encounter in implementing those functionalities? And we had a lot of debate on should we put in certain slides. Now, what slides am I talking about? And I like to highlight that with a certain example. Does this date mean anything to anyone? Probably not. I'll make it easier for you. Which country is this? Very good. Home sweet home. Then the combination of these two. Does that mean anything to anyone? That morning, we broke through a record in the Netherlands. And it's not a record that I'm really proud of, because that morning the traffic jam was more than 1,000 kilometers in the Netherlands that day. And if we zoom into a particular part of the Netherlands, you'll see a map of that traffic jam. And you can understand red means traffic. Now, my hometown is there in there as well, and I'll highlight it for you. It's, and I'll pronounce it in the Netherlands, it's called Katwijk. It's near the sea, so I can walk within a couple of minutes to the beach, which is fine in the summer, but the rest of the year I'm struggling with all this traffic, which is true for everybody else in the Netherlands, because it looks bigger on the screen than it is in real life. Now, why did I put in this slide? Because if I would only put in this slide and not tell you this story, you wouldn't understand this particular picture. So when I get all excited about a solution, and specifically a solution like the Cloud OS, and I'm attending sessions like you are, I'm always looking for information like, where do I place all the components? I'm in desperate need of a diagram. So we did not only put in a diagram in this particular session, we worked throughout the session and used that diagram over and over again. So without further ado, the diagram. We'll start with the enterprise organization. And what I'd like you to do is imagine that I will have an easy job today because I'll be the tenant, and you'll have the hard job of being the admin. And throughout the session, we'll come back and I'll ask you questions thinking about where should you place certain components. Now, looking at an enterprise organization, you'll see that all these components, and we'll see them through the session backing and forth again. First of all, you'll notice that this tenant has unlimited access to all workloads. And you can say, well, Mark, you're a nice guy and all, but I don't trust you for a bit. So I don't want you to have unlimited access to those workloads. So what should we do? So in an enterprise organization, what you'll see then is that is segmented. So you have multiple subnets, and based on access control list, you, the admin, can define what workloads do I have access to. And you can now see that I can have access to the functionalities that I use at a tenant and my actual workloads, but not the infrastructure that is highly privileged. Now, turn that around and look at an enterprise organization. I'm the first one to leave the building because I'm the tenant. I'm not located at the service provider. I'm an external customer. And this external customer is going to access resources behind the firewall. So the first requirement that you'll see at every service provider is a DMZ. So this DMZ brings a problem because all those functionalities that are now colored blue in the DMZ will have to have access to the workloads that are running in the management domain. So have domain authentication. So the first thing to do if you're going to have a DMZ is create a separate domain for that. So all resources that will be accessed from the internet are going to be in that separate domain. What do you need for a domain? Anyone? There you go, domain controllers. And what I also would like to have is a dedicated SQL instance, because I don't want to have port 1433 going into my own environment. So this is the picture that you'll see throughout the whole session, and we'll mute the information that is relevant for that particular part. We'll start with Windows Azure Pack, because there's much more to discuss. But Windows Azure Pack in itself is complicated enough. Who's familiar with the web platform installer? That's about 1/10. With the web platform installer allows you to install Windows Azure Pack. So that's a bit scary if only like 1/10 is familiar with the web platform installer, because that probably means that the rest never have installed Windows Azure Pack. How many components do you think, out of the box, without third-party extensions, are available with the installation for Windows Azure Pack? It's at least a lot, because you see the choices we'll have. Who will say A? Just a normal installer, and you'll have a list in a web platform installer saying, and everybody's now looking it up quickly, how many Windows Azure Pack components can you select? Yeah, during the installation. So who will say A? No. 2. Who will say B? 11. 4. Who will say C? That's a lot more. And who will say D? Well, the last two are both true. And I'll explain why. I actually said 13 in the preparation of the slides, and I think it was Walter Oliver told me, no, there's 14. So we debated on it, and I checked again. Yeah, it's 14, but the interesting thing is there's one component called the Portal and API Express installer, and this will install all other components on one single box. So we can debate if that's the component or not. So 13, 14, we're all good. Now, if we look at Windows Azure Pack, and we mute all the irrelevant information, we have two roles. We have the tenant part, which is me, and we have the admin functionalities, which is you guys. Now, the first thing that we'll do is separate those two functionalities by subnetting the DMZ. And this is crucial because there are so many admin functionalities that are high privileged that can do damage if they're used incorrectly within your environment, that you'll want to have a separation between those two in the DMZ. So we'll subnet those. And that'll mean that me, the tenant, will only have access to those parts living in the top and not the bottom. So that's good to remember. And the admins, you guys, you have access unlimited to all those neat features. Now, I'll actually show you the components, those 14. Which are they? First of all, as Bradley just showed earlier, we have an admin portal and a tenant portal. The admin portal is located at the admin box, as you would expect, and the tenant on the tenant box. Each portal has its own authentication site out of the box. And we'll see later on what federation means in that particular part. But the authentication site for the admin side will use Active Directory integration. And the tenant authentication side will use a SQL.NET membership provider, which means that all user accounts are stored in a SQL database. Then we have 4 APIs. And there's a lot of confusion about what do the APIs do. So I'll show one API in a second. We have the best practice analyzer, which will scan your environment and let you know if you have configured anything correctly, and the Portal API Express. And then there are 4 resource extensions that you can optionally install in your environment to use and hook up with the infrastructure in the back. Now, we'll start with the Portal API Express. As I said earlier, it's a selection of all those components that will install on a single box. Now, we just saw that in the DMZ, we want to separate those roles. So we're not going to use that one. It's good for a lab environment, but don't use it in production because it won't scale. Then we have the tenant side. We want to have the tenants accessing their roles, so we should have at least the tenant side. If you look at the tenant authentication side, for more advanced authentication scenarios, you want to use ADFS. So we're not going to install this. If you're going to federate with ADFS, you do not require this site, so you don't have to install it. We're not going to do this here either. This is also true for the admin side. It does use Active Directory authentication, so why should you use ADFS? Because in essence it's the same. Well, 2 reasons. First of all, ADFS will allow you to federate with other identity providers, so you have more advanced scenarios. And the second thing is, this Windows Azure Pack environment is installed in the DMZ domain. So that will mean that my admin accounts will also have to live in that domain. But you might think that they're actually living in a management domain. So for that reason, we're not going to use the admin authentication side either. We'll use ADFS for that. The tenant public API, and this is what I'm going to show you in a second, will allow you to run PowerShell against your environment from the outside world. So me, the tenant, will have access and can deploy virtual machines, for instance, with PowerShell, which is quite interesting. Then all the other roles will go to the admin boxes, which you can scale out, and you can even select to distribute those roles against those admin boxes as well. This is the design that we usually see. For the other 4 extensions, you'll have to have a separate infrastructure. We won't handle this because I only have an hour. So let's have a look at the public tenant API. I have my own machine here, which is hooked up to this purple gable, and this purple gable will give me internet access. I'm not sure which firewall I'm going to hit, so what I have done, the API, I've configured it with a web service, server certificate on port 443. That should at least give me access. So what a lot of people don't know, and I'll log into the environment. is that the API is there out of the box. And I'll turn off the volume on my phone, and then I'll show you some ADFS as well. As you can see, I'm directed to an ADFS portal which is customized. And in the previous slide, I had 3 ways of authenticating against ADFS for accessing Windows Azure Pack. Now, I use Active Directory and enter my credentials. I'll shut up for a second. I'm not making any mistakes. And what I've done, as you might see, is I have configured ADFS to hook up to Microsoft Azure and use multi-factor authentication from Microsoft Azure. So as a service provider of an enterprise organization, you're in control of your own environment, but you still can use functionalities from Microsoft Azure. Let's see if I can get a phone call. Try to help it with the microphone so you see what happens. Should take a couple of seconds. There it is. Speaker.
Thank you for using Microsoft Sign-In Verification System. Please press the pound key to finish your verification. If you do not finish it, you have been signed in.
This is a nice lady. She's always very friendly. She's working 24/7, and she always lets me in. So what I have here is a Windows Azure Pack environment that you'll see when you access it as a tenant. And what I'm going to do is use a custom URL, publish settings, and probably nobody knows this. And when I enter that, I'm taken to a custom portal. And I'll be prompted to download a file. Now, this file, I'm going to make this naming convention a bit more easy for the script to import it. Use my own name. Actually contains a couple of things. It contains information about my 2 subscriptions that I have. It will generate 2 certificates in the portal. I'll show that to you as well. And everyone who has seen this before might think to itself, what are those certificate entries for? With this functionality, they are created automatically. These certificates will contain the public key of the certificates that are contained within its public setting file, and this public setting file will contain a private key. When I import them, those 2 keys are generated within my machine, and based on those certificates, I can access my own subscriptions and do actions against them, which I'll show now. So let's open the script. What I have installed is the Windows, or I should say Microsoft Azure PowerShell that you can download over the internet. And what a lot of people don't know, it does contain PowerShell commandlets for Windows Azure Pack as well. So if you want to do this, just install the Windows Azure PowerShell module. And first of all, let me import certificates. Now, when I look at my certificate store, on the user account, so let's say you're doing this on a remote desktop server, you have multiple users, that is fine. And I have the certificate store, and you'll see that 2 certificates, 1 for each subscription, is created, and the friendly name is also the name for my subscription. And these 2, as you can see, have a private key that map to those 2 certificates that are in my subscription. Now, that allows me to run, for instance, let's get me an overview of what subscriptions do I have. I can select against what subscription do I want to take actions. And this will take a couple of seconds because this is the first command actually against the API. The other ones are just taken from the local file. We'll request all the VMs in that particular subscription, the name and the status of that virtual machine. So when we have a look at my machines that I have, and I selected this particular subscription, we'll see that we'll have virtual machines. I think a couple of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 machines. This is what EES Recycle will do to you. We'll have to wait for a couple of seconds. While this is loading, what you can also do is deploy a virtual machine. I have to have some information about that virtual machine. First of all, what is the name that I give it? Second of all, what template will I use? There it is. I said 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, yes. And I'll have to enter some credentials. Actually, the settings that I'll enter during the graphical user interface, this is what I also specify in my PowerShell script. So let's run this as well. Let me think of an easy password, which is password. And when I now go back to the portal and refresh that, it should deploy a machine which is called MVE VM API. Let's refresh that. There it is. Now this is interesting. Let's say I would be an enterprise organization and I'm a tenant in the enterprise organization where I have a big script that'll do something with applications and etc. And I need a SQL database for that as well. And I have that in a VM. You can then integrate that to that script. And this is what we have actually done at a couple of enterprise organizations, leveraging the API and not having them go to the portal. So they can script, for instance, and schedule those scripts to run at night. And we don't have the requirement of service management automation, and I have the tenant still the possibility to integrate with those scripts. So just to give an idea of the API possibilities, and this is just one of them. Well, we've seen some authentication already. First of all, we've seen the out-of-the-box authentication. The admin side, AD integration, the tenant side with the SQL membership provider. We saw some ADFS. I just used that portal. We saw a web application proxy. You didn't notice, but I actually entered against a web application proxy that proxied my request forward to ADFS. I integrated with Azure AD, where I used multi-factor authentication. So you have so many scenarios that you can use with authentication that a lot of people find it complex. And what I'll do in a second is I'll configure it for you from scratch. That'll take 20 minutes, and then you'll have a complete up and running environment with ADFS integration. Now, where do we place these components? Same diagram again. I'm on the outside there. And what happens when I access the tenant portal? I have no authentication. I have no certificate whatsoever. When I exit it, the tenant portal will redirect me to the authentication site. It has to know where that authentication site is. So we have to tell it to Windows Azure Pack, where do we have to get that token? And when the tenant is redirected to the authentication site, this is actually the web application proxy. The web application proxy will then forward the request to our internal environment. So it's not directly to the internal environment, forwarded into the DM set. And then we have, from ADFS, multiple scenarios. We can say, okay, I want to have an Active Directory internally. We can say, I want to have a shared environment for my tenants where those authentication sites are living and where we have the stores for those user accounts. But we can also federate with an external identity, which can be Microsoft Azure or whatever identity you want to use. When the token is generated by the Security Token Service, the STS, it's then passed backwards to the user, the tenant, to me, and I'll present it to Windows Azure Pack. And Windows Azure Pack will say, okay, this guy claims he's Mark van Eyck. If he says that is so, then I believe it. Otherwise, you're not going to come in. Now, let's hope this all goes well. Then we're 20 minutes from a working ADFS environment. Close this one. So what I have here, I have a domain controller. I don't want to make it too complicated because otherwise we won't manage. The domain controller has ADFS component installed, nothing else. I have not yet configured it. I have created a web server certificate with a wildcard, just a default web server certificate, nothing fancy. And I have imported that one. And I have a Windows Azure Pack environment, which is not set up, as you can see. So I'll still have that configured. So I've only installed the components, nothing else. Now, let's start with configuring ADFS. How complex is that? There we go. So the first thing I'll have to do is give it a name. On what name am I going to access ADFS? What I've done, I've created a couple of records in DNS that will help me to resolve those names. And the two records that I have created, the domain name internally is techad.local, and I've created an additional zone called techad.com. And in that zone, I have created 1, 2, 3 records. And these 2 records are pointing at the Windows Azure Pack server, and this record is pointing at the domain controller, which will actually be the ADFS server. So that will give me resolvement on those names. Then the wizard, I can select to create the first federation server, fine by me. It will automatically select my credentials that I'm logged in with. Excellent. I have to select the certificate. Like I said before, I generated a web server certificate with a wildcard. It will collect the common name from the web server certificate and provide it to you as an option. Well, I don't want to connect on the star, so I'll make that STS, standing for Security Token Service. And here I can display a name that the end user will see when he logs onto the portal. What environment am I authenticating against? So we call that TechAd 2014. Then I'll have to create a service account. This service account is just a domain user. Nothing else, nothing less. I haven't created any additional permissions for this user. Specify that. Okay, and the password. I can create a Windows internal database, which up to some point will allow you some sort of high availability. It's not really high available. If you want to have high availability, you rather have a SQL database and use always on or failover clustering. We'll use the internal database for now. It's going to check if all my prerequisites are correct. Yes, excellent. And then I'll hit configure. So while this is running, we'll skip over to the Windows Azure Pack server. And here I'm going to configure Windows Azure Pack. The only thing I've done is I booted up the web platform installer, selected the components, and installed those. And when you finish, you'll be hit with this particular site. So what I'll do is I'll specify the name of the SQL server. I'll use SQL Server Authentication, and this is important. You can use Windows Authentication, but your SQL Server has to be in mixed mode because it will generate security counts within the local SQL store. We'll use SQL Server for now. It's fine. Specify the password. And I also have to specify a passphrase. This passphrase will be used each time you'll add an additional server to the environment. We'll validate it once. Excellent. And I'll specify it again. Yes, fine with me. And what you can see here is the list of components that I selected, and all the way at the bottom, you'll see that I selected SQL Server extension, which allows me to provide database as a service functionality. Now, this is the easiest that I can do without having a whole setup of infrastructure for hypervisors, virtual machines, and stuff like that. So I've decided to do that. And I then configure the whole ADFS integration, log on as a user, and subscribe to a plan that I will create with a SQL database, deploy a database, and then I'll create Bradley as a user as well, give him access through a group, so just an Active Directory group, and based on his Active Directory account, he can then access my subscription without ever logging on before. So that's done. Yes. Now, the first thing that will happen when you have configured Windows Azure Pack is that it's all configured on internal ports, so custom ports, 3009.1 and 3007.2. Not very user-friendly, and also if you want to access from the internet, it's going to be a problem. I'll show you by accessing the tenant side that I'll first be head at a random port. There we go. So this is 30,081, and when I hit it, it will actually collect the information from the database asking where is the tenant side living. And it will then provide me that information back, and I have to click that certificate error again. So not very user-friendly. It's not a question, should you configure it after that you deployed it? Yeah, you should. Let's see how the ADFS environment is doing. That's very nice. And the second that will happen is when I'm going to authenticate, I'll be prompted for the admin authentication side. So this is the tenant side, and this is the default tenant authentication side that is installed out of the box. You can use that, but as you've seen before, we use ADFS integration for that. And we look at the admin authentication side. This is the same issue. I'm prompted for a custom port and even a self-signed certificate. So if you want to change that, in the previous version you would just select the certificate, change the IIS port to 443, and you're done. Well, that's a bit more difficult now because you're integrating with Federation. So you can not only change that, you'll have to update the database. You can do that through PowerShell scripts, and you can point it at any authentication site that you want to use. So let's get back to our admin side, continue there. I should be prompted within a second to authenticate to Active Directory. There we go. So this is tagged. And what you notice is that the admin authentication side, the admin side is actually quite similar to the tenant side. So this is what you're going to see when you log on because you're the admins. Now, what I'll do is I'll create a plan, connect to a SQL database, which is actually my SQL database that's also running my management workloads, Windows Azure Pack. I shouldn't recommend that for production environment, but for the demo it's okay. So what I'll do is first configure SQL, connect it to my SQL server, and as you notice, this is the same as I just used before. Specify the same username and password, and specify a database size that a tenant can use to create databases. Very nice. Now, the second one, so this is the first step. I created a resource provider and connected it to an infrastructure component in the back. The second one, create a plan. And I call this plan tagged SQL servers. So this is the component I just created. This plan is now created, and the last thing I'll do is I'll make this plan public. Change access, public. And that means that a tenant has the possibility to subscribe to this particular plan. So what that's done, let's have a look at the IAS, and I'll change the tenant side here. Added bindings, change that to 443. And what is interesting to note is that in this version of IAS, in 2012 R2, you have the possibility to create host headers running on 443 with server name indication, which allows you to have multiple sites running on 443 with SSL and still have tenants going to the correct site. So I'll specify the name, which is manage.target.com, require server name indication, and I'll select that same wildcard certificate. Now, in the previous version, you're done. But now I have to update the database and point this site to the authentication site. So we'll do that with a script. We'll first import a module that we need for configuring this. And this is the Windows Azure Pack configuration module. And you'll see when I request the information on the tenant side, it's actually pointing at my local host, my internal NetBIOS name. So not the FQDN that I want to use. So we'll update that endpoint, and you'll see that it's now pointing at the right site and at the right port. So that's step one. The second thing that we'll need to do is we need to update Windows Azure Pack with the information from our authentication site, which is ADFS. So I'll create a string to authenticate against the database. That is part one. And then the second thing is I'll request the information that is living in the database now. And it will say that the authentication site it will use is still the old value. We want to update that to the security token service, which I created earlier, which is this value. So we'll update that one. And this is all I have to do within Windows Azure Pack to integrate with ADFS. Of course, I have to update ADFS as well. So we'll have a look there. ADFS is configured. I'll open the console. And when looking at ADFS, there are two particular parts that are important. This is the claims provider trust. As the name already says, it will provide the claims for me. And we have the relying party. And the relying party is the party that will absorb those claims. In this case, Windows Azure Pack. So we'll configure a relying party. When we look at the claims provider trust, you'll see that there's already one in place. This is created out of the box against Active Directory in the domain where you installed ADFS. And we'll update this in a second. We'll start with the relying party trust. And the relying party trust, copy the URL. Very nice. And this URL is pointing at, as you can see, the tenant authentication site. So it's just pointing at each other. So we go back, start, point that URL pointing to the tenant authentication site, and it will actually talk to the tenant authentication site and request information. It will specify a name. You can change it if you want. You can configure it for multi-factor authentication, which we saw earlier. We're not going to use that now. I can choose what the default setting is going to be. And I want to add users later on, or maybe deny users later on. I'll start by permitting anyone. And you see a lot of information coming from the tenant authentication side. So it's already talking to the tenant authentication side. And next, I can edit the claim rules. And the claim rules will allow me to pass claims to Windows Azure Pack. And as you can see now, it's empty. So it's not going to pass anything. So it won't work. So what I'll do is I add a rule. And there are two types of claims that Windows Azure Pack will accept. UPN and group. You require a UPN. A group is optional. I'll use both. And the claims provider trust will provide me with the claims. And the relying party will absorb those claims and pass them through to Windows Azure Pack. So we just use the pass-through. And the claim rule is then UPN, specify the claim type. That's a difficult one, UPN, pass through all claims. Excellent. And the other one we're going to add, same way, incoming claim, which is the group claim, and specify the type, which is called group. There we are. Now, the claims provider trust will automatically, out of the box, specify the UPN, but it won't add the group. So we'll manually have to add that as well. And we send LDAP information as a claim. So it's talking to AD through LDAP, which is called the group claim. Select the attribute store, which is called Active Directory. And I have to wait a second for it to populate. There it is. Select the token group qualified by domain name and map that to the group claim. And then now it's passing the actual token group information from the count that is coming in as a group claim, which will then be passed through to Windows Azure Pack. That's all. Now, when I open the tenant portal on the new URL, which is anyone? Manage, exactly. You're still not sleeping, great. HTTPS, oh, it's already here. I should now, because I'm not authenticated, oh yeah, there's one thing I forgot. Because I'm internally, ADFS will say, this is an internal account, I'll use single sign-on. This URL has got a data in it. And then it will say, well, Internet Explorer will do that for you. You're in the internet zone. And it will not pass my credentials. So I can do two things. I can add the URL to the trusted zones, or what I'm going to do, so you'll have a better picture of what is going on, change the internal authentication, so I'm actually presented with the web browser functionality from ADFS, which I can do here, and edit that. And you can see here that for the extranet, it's already using form-based authentication, and for the internet, it's using Windows authentication. I'll change that. There we go. And Windows Azure Pack will only accept tokens with JSON web tickets. And by design, by default, this is not enabled on ADFS. We can check that value, and you'll see that the enable JSON web ticket is false. So we have to enable that. So just two small scripts, and knowing what you're doing, and within 20 minutes you have an up and running environment, Windows Azure Pack talking against ADFS. And as you can see now, I'm redirected. It displayed the names that I specified earlier. I have one user account, which is called mark@techet.com. And when I now log in, I can subscribe to that TechEd SQL plan that I just created earlier. I can create a database. And when I then log out, create a new user, add it to a group, and specify the permissions for that group, and I log in again as that new user, I should be able to see my objects that I created earlier. So here we have the tenant portal. I'm a new user. Thank you. Close that one. And I'll create a new account, subscription. There's our TechEd SQL description. I'll create a database. MarkDB. No typos. So I now have a database. I'll log out. sign out, close this, and go to AD. Anyone has a name for a user, so you know that I'm not cheating? Anyone? Name? Bob? James? Plant? Maybe select this one. There we go. Password. Now, what did I just forget? Add this user here. Bob. Is give Bob permissions. So log in with my tenant account again. And where can I do that? My accounts, administrators, and this is the interesting part with claims. You can actually enter any type of information because it's a claim. So what I can do is use the actual information that's correct. Taget grp underscore taget. This is the domain group. Give the permissions here and say yes. But what I could also do is specify any information, some bogus information. It won't work, but that's the essence of claims. So you have to be careful. What information am I entering here? Now log out again. And log in as Bob at taget.com, password, and I should now have access to MarkDB. I'm a new user. Close this, and you'll see it standing here. So I have the same permissions as the other user. So I'm not sure if I did in 20 minutes, but you have a good general idea how fast you can configure Windows Azure Pack with ADFS. And I'm not even finished yet, guys. Service Provider Foundation. We'll go back to a couple of deck slides. What you have with Service Provider Foundation is that you can configure a lot of components, and it's easy to make the wrong decisions, and it's hard to make the right. So what I like to do is help you out with what decisions do I have to make. What permissions do I have to configure? This actually took me 1 vacation and 100 of snapshots before I got the right information, and I still did use that 1.5 years for now, and it's working great. So looking at SPF is the layer between Windows Azure Pack and VMM, and it will add multi-tenancy and expose VMM functionality through a RESTful OData API. It's a web service. So what you need to have, first of all, you have to create 4 groups in AD. And this is the AD in the management domain. And when you have those 4 groups, you also have to create a service account. And this service account is a domain user that has to have some additional permissions. And the additional permissions that you'll have to create is first, you have to add this service account to the 4 local SPF groups that are on the SPF server. That is 1. You'll have to add the service account to VMM as an admin. That's 2. And the third one is add this service account to SQL as a sysadmin. That's quite some permissions. And the reason why we're adding an additional account, which is located on the SPF server itself, so this is a local account, that is the account that we'll use to register from Windows Azure Pack against SPF. And why this additional local account? You could use the domain account because of the amount of permission that this account has. If you use the local account, then it will delegate the permissions to the domain account. This additional step is most often forgotten, but it's very important. Please remember, you can only have one SPF registration in Windows Azure Pack. So if you have multiple data centers, think about the registration to VMM you're going to do. You probably end up with multiple VMM environments, each data center one, but only one SPF. So please make this highly available, and also think about where you're going to place that. Anyone familiar with network virtualization? Quite a few hands. In essence, and this is way high level, it's like trains driving between stations. You can see the train, but you cannot see what is in the train. What is in the train is the package between the tenant virtual machines and the train itself that you can see is the communication between the two Hyper-V hosts. And this is really high level. When we look at network virtualization, it's nowhere in the picture. There's no word saying network virtualization whatsoever. There are many places where you can configure network virtualization, but the most important part is the gateway, because network virtualization is a great functionality, but it's really useless if you can't access your virtual machine, if you have no gateway going out and in. The recommended configuration for network virtualization is to have, yes, another domain. A separate domain where you'll install two Hyper-V hosts, which are dedicated for the gateway. And on top of that, you can create VMs that will act as gateways, and you can have multiple VMs and multiple gateways on top of that gateway VMs. Now, what happens when a tenant accesses the tenant portal? He has the possibility to create, and we'll see that in a second, a net rule, for instance, or create a site-to-site VPN. So instead of you guys, the admins, configuring that firewall for me, I can do it myself. And I know that admins are lazy, so why do it yourself if the tenant can do it? As long as it's in a contained environment, and he can only do it for his own environment and not another environment. Now, the integration with Windows Azure Pack will allow you to do that. What happens is when a tenant will give that command, and we'll see that in a second how that works, it's an action against the tenant API, which will then translate it to the admin API. The admin API will talk to SPF, like we saw on the previous slide. SPF will give PowerShell commands to VMM, and VMM is talking to the gateway. So these are a lot of components talking to each other. Now the gateway is then updated with information on that particular tenant, which allows the tenant to have, for instance, a NAT rule going directly to a virtual machine. Now let's have a look at how that works. See, my environment is still open. I have a virtual machine here and a virtual network. This virtual network, and I'm still connected over the internet, has a public IP address, which I can net to virtual machines on that virtual network. Now, to show you that I'm doing this right now, open the URL on this IP address, and you'll see that it'll time out. Now, looking at the gateway, you'll see the same external IP address. Copy it for you here. So V, 120, 120. And I can also see what mappings are available at this time. None. So when I go to the portal, you can see it won't resolve. I'll add a rule, and you can see how easy this is. Call this web server, which protocol, which port. I can enter IP address of a virtual machine that's running in a virtual network, but I don't know anything about IP addresses. I just want to select a virtual machine. So select this one, and you also see the VM that I just deployed through PowerShell popping up there as well. And the internal port is also 80. And looking at the gateway and running this command again, you'll see that in the gateway, through that whole diagram we just saw, a NAT rule is created. And when I resolve this port again, I can do some shameless promotions for my other 2 sessions. Very easy, and you have done nothing. I've done it myself, the tenant. Who's familiar with service management automation? Quite a few hands. Who's familiar with Orchestrator? Oh, keep them all down. Forget Orchestrator. Service management automation. It's integrated, tightly integrated with Windows Azure Pack. The first time I looked at Windows Azure Pack, and specifically service management automation, this was the feeling I got. A big ball of goo. And I didn't know where to start. So what we found when we talked to customers, enterprise organizations, service providers, and specifically automation, is this. Make good use cases. If you start with a good use case yourself, then it's much more easier to get acquainted with service management automation, because it's easier to dive in. I've seen numerous scripts and didn't understand it until I finally had a good use case, which forced me to start with the bare principles and then work my way from there. So this is just a simple thing that I want to give you. When we look at configuring the components for service management automation, there are also a lot of components that are going on. First of all, you have 2 roles in SMA. So web service, I should say 3, is the runbook worker, and you have the PowerShell module. The web service is the same as SPF for VMM. It's the API endpoint. So Windows Azure Pack will talk to that API over port 9090 by design. You can change that if you want. And SMA web service will translate those commands to the actual runbook workers that will perform the runbooks. And what's interesting in Windows Azure Pack is that, for instance, you can integrate runbooks with actions that a tenant does at virtual machines. But the actual runbook is triggered from the runbook worker. So if you want to have an action going against VMM, you'll have to install the components, the PowerShell module for VMM in the runbook worker. Otherwise, those PowerShell runbooks won't work. Now, there are 2 things that most people don't know. If you're setting this up, the SPF must trust the certificate you're using for SMA. Please remember that one. And also, a second one, which costs us, I think you guys, a week or so, add the SPF Apple ID, which you saw on the previous slide, to the local SMA admin group on the SMA web service. Those 2 things are very important, otherwise it's not gonna work. Remote console. This is the first thought I had with remote console. It's very basic, but it always works. Anybody familiar with remote console, what it is? Not this picture, but only a few. Then I'll have to show it in just a small demo. Let's say I have a virtual machine and it crashed, or I configured a wrong IP address. How am I going to access it? I can't, because I cannot remote into it. This is where remote console comes in. What option does it give you? It allows you to connect to a virtual machine, connect, console, and you'll see in a minute how we do that in the underlying infrastructure without remoting in. So I'm actually connecting to the underlying Hyper-V host, but I have only access to that particular virtual machine in a particular time frame that the certificate is valid. But it allows me to connect to the machine without even remoting in. So if remote desktop is crashed in the machine, you can still access it. And I have no copy-paste functionality or stuff like that, but I can make changes. So this is very interesting to see. So this is remote console. Moving back towards how should you configure that, because I can imagine that you'll say, wait a minute, you're on the outside and you're connected to my Hyper-V host, it's in the management domain, what about security? Now, zooming out all the information that isn't relevant, you'll see first things that is going to pop up is a certificate. And the certificate will be imported in the VMM database. And based on that certificate, each request is signed. So how does this work? All the Hyper-V hosts trust that certificate as well, as does the remote desktop gateway that will allow me to connect in through the internet. The remote desktop gateway also has a public certificate, which is the URL that I'm actually connecting on. Now, let's say I'm clicking that button again, like I just did. What actually happened is I'm prompted with an RDP file. And this RDP file will contain that certificate, which is a hashed version of the connection that I'm making. It will contain the remote desktop gateway, the settings, where do I need to configure, connect to, and then it will forward the request, so it's in essence the same as the web application proxy does, but then for remote desktop traffic, through the firewall on port 2179. And it will connect to the Hyper-V host, and it's in essence just a console connection as you would through a Hyper-V manager, for instance. But then over the internet for a tenant. That's quite interesting. And the last thing, and I think that I'm out of time, small one, VM role. Who's familiar with the VM role? It's like the service template counterpart for the Windows Azure Pack. There are a couple of things to note here. First of all, you cannot use classification. So no bandwidth classification, no storage classification. You'll have to use other functionalities for that. No dynamic memory at this time. So that's an interesting thing to note. But the interesting thing also is VMrole allows you to completely integrate with applications and install applications as part of the deployment. You can scale up, and it's also interesting to know that VMrole will use differencing disk. So if you deploy one VMrole and deploy another, it will use the same base disk. That will save you specifically, let's say you deploy 1,000, a lot of storage. Call to action. Next year, make sure everybody knows what a web platform installer is. Would that mean that you have at least installed Windows Azure Pack one time? Build your clouds and power them by the Cloud OS. Thank you very much. Oh, and please help me out. It's my first year at TechEd, so please vote for me for president. Where is it? You can also win. There it is. Thanks, guys.
Multi-tenanted services for self-service IaaS and PaaS offerings. They do want to do usage chargeback, but with a real chargeback against your credit card. They want to actually do customer billing. The same data that drives a chargeback solution and a billing solution is the same meters, the same usage meters. So both hosting providers and enterprise want that same access of data. Hosting service providers, they want extreme automation. They want to automate everything. Because every person they put in supporting the cloud, their value proposition goes down. It's costing, they're losing money. The more they can automate, their margins increase. So automation is a big deal. They're very interested in that hardware monetization, optimized hardware. One thing that a hosting service provider wants to do that enterprises don't typically want to do is they want to upsell you. Every time you go in to use the site, oh, Have you thought about a new certificate? Do you need more? How about another domain name? Oh, have you think about more storage? How about this capability? Service providers are always interested in the upsell opportunities, slightly different. Enterprise, not so much. But hosting service providers also need to create differentiated offers from public clouds. How do they differentiate themselves? Do value-add offers? It may be through SLA offerings, through different kinds of hardware configurations and different deployments, but at the end of the day, they still want to provide some of the attributes of the public cloud. And again, finally, service providers need to be able to brand and own their customer relationship and identity and understand that the business that they're operating. Well, when we look at this, we find a set of common requirements. Both service providers and the enterprise want an enterprise-friendly solution. Enterprises for their own purposes and for service providers to attract enterprises. They both need multi-tenanted IaaS, preferably something as easy as what Azure has become. They're both interested in the usage metrics so they can create custom billing solutions as appropriate to their business. Automation, big deal. Both data centers need automation. They both are interested in hardware utilization and maximizing that. They both want to offer their tenants choice. They both want to create unique offers. I may create in the enterprise one offer for my DevOps team. I may create another offer type for the marketing or line of business team. I may create unique offers, create different pools of resources that are used to address the needs of different customers within my organization. Service providers are used to doing that and doing that all the time. All right. So with that in mind, let's take a look at the approach we took with Windows Azure Pack. This is a marketecture. This is a high-level abstraction of what Azure looks like. There's the Azure Fabric, the blue cloud, that's delivering compute, storage, and networking. On that, we run a bunch of services. These services expose functionality. We aggregate all that functionality through a common API. We layer on a management portal that can talk to that management API. Our customers can come in and access the portal or API from the public and access that. From an administrative standpoint, we have the Azure IT groups and product groups are actually maintaining the services on the back end. And that's at a very high level, kind of the Azure abstraction of things. When we looked at how to provide this technology inside partner data centers, both the enterprise and with service providers, instead of the Azure Fabric, we realized we actually have very good technologies in partner data centers today. Technologies that are evolving and providing a lot of capability from Windows Server and System Center. So the question is, let's partner with our technology assets that are going into partner data centers to make them more cloud aware, more Azure aware. Take the learnings that we're getting from Azure and funnel those back into Windows Server and System Center. Then, on top of that, let's start building out the same kind of multi-tenanted infrastructure that we built out for Azure. That is, we'll run a set of these services, these customer-facing services on top of that fabric. We'll take that tenant and portal and API. These are the same source code assets, the same hardened assets that we deploy and operate in Azure. Let's take those, package them up, make those deployable in our partner data centers so that their customers and IT's customers or a service provider's customers can log in and get a comparable experience that they would have gotten had they actually gone to Azure. But we needed to do more than that. We had to extend it. We had to create an operator view. Now, how do we run Azure? Well, hello. Ooh, kind of loud. Scared me. My name is Bradley Bartz. I'm here with Mark Van Elk and we're going to discuss Windows Azure Pack. We'll give you just a brief overview of what is this thing that you keep hearing about called Windows Azure Pack, and why are we doing this? But beyond that, we'll get into some real-world experiences about what's happening in actual deployments and how is this being used in real life. And that's where Mark's going to give us these deep insights. So that's the idea. We'll give you an introduction into the platform, Windows Azure Pack, the designs of the platform. Fundamentally, this is a project that's centered around this transformation of the data center. Now, that's not just about the transformation of our partner data centers. It's also about the transformation of the Azure data centers, the Microsoft data centers, about delivering a modern data center for app mobility, for modern agile applications and user scenarios, for big data scenarios, for cloud on-demand, scale with real-time performance, infrastructure designed and withstand failure, resource managed at data center scales. Our solution, the Microsoft strategy, is one that says we're going to provide a cloud platform that our partners and customers can rely on, regardless of the data center they choose to deploy their applications and services in. Sure, we'd love it if you bring all your applications and all your workloads to Microsoft's Azure public cloud. But we realize that may not be appropriate for every workload and every customer. So what's the alternative? The alternative is to start providing our cloud technologies, our platform, our solutions into partner data centers, whether it be for a hosting service provider or the enterprise. That's what we mean by Cloud OS, this consistent cloud platform that can run in partner data centers, that customers, the cloud consumer, the application developers, the line of business operators can deploy their applications to with confidence. So our envision, this consistent cloud platform, the diagram on the left is exactly what we're referring there, where one, the customer, that's the data center in your organization, Microsoft's, the public cloud data center, and the service provider data center, delivering this consistent cloud platform that can run in any of these data centers to enable modern business applications, empower people-centric IT, unlock insights on any data. That is the transformation of the data center. Ultimately delivering the Office 365, Xbox Live, Bing. We're taking the learnings. It's one thing to aspire to build a great cloud platform. It's a whole nother thing to actually deliver it, take the live site issues that happen, and maintain a cloud 24/7 in production. Well, we're doing that. We're learning a ton of information from our Microsoft Azure investments and running production applications there, and we're taking those learnings, the hardening of the cloud platform, and bringing that into our partner data centers for running their workloads. At the end of the day, it is to deliver these high-performance storage and industry-standard hardware, multi-tenanted environments with isolation, software-defined networking, policy-based automation, and application elasticity. Now, it's worth noting this is a journey. This is the vision and aspiration of where we're going. The Windows Azure Pack is our first installment on this journey. Did we get there in the first release? No. You'll see some of that when Mark goes through the details and uncovers some of the nuts and bolts and real-world experiences. But make no doubt about it, this is the path we're on. We're on the path of rationalizing our cloud technologies in the public cloud, in the private cloud, in the hosted cloud for this consistent cloud platform. And it's worth noting, Azure is designed for hyperscale, cloud across the globe. Not every partner's data center has those exact needs. They're a little smaller in scale for what they need to support, but they still need to support scale, elasticity, robustness, and still have an ability to go cross-cloud even. So this is the direction. We're working on these capabilities. Now, as we've met with partners, we found out that enterprises are very interested in cloud and have a lot of the same interests as service providers. But what do enterprises specifically want? They want a flexible cloud with familiar technologies and no vendor lock-in. Enterprises want to be able to make choices about what clouds they use and consume, but they want that technology in their own data center. They are interested in multi-tenanted clouds, preferably as easy to use as Azure. There's a phenomenon going on in IT called rogue IT, where you have all these developers and agile groups going kind of bypassing IT and going out to third-party external clouds, moving production workloads that aren't really supposed to be running in those external clouds offsite. Well, how do they bring that under the control and back under governance? How can an IT organization provide those kind of agile, elastic, on-demand capabilities that the service provider is doing? Or hosting providers also need chargeback. What is chargeback? The ability to monetize, to account for the resources that are running in your data center. Now, a hosting provider, they'll do that with a credit card. You'll know. You'll get the bill. What happens in an enterprise? Well, enterprise IT organizations still need to account for resources being used by different organizations within the broader org. That's known as chargeback. Can they do that for cloud services? And what does that mean? They want these simple automated operations. Automation is a key tenet in any data center. More effective utilization of existing hardware and assets. the end of the day, IT budgets are often constrained. I need to be able to do this either on existing hardware or be able to incrementally grow as I bring new hardware into the data center. I want to have tenant choice. This is this idea of providing dynamic resources available to my customers, to an IT organization's customers that come in for the services they consume. At the end of the day, again, I need to be able to create, as an IT organization, commodity offers I might do for some of my customers who might be needing just, it may not be a line of business application, it may be a dev team that is doing this for some dev test scenarios or some scenarios where they don't need a production deployment. I need to have clouds like that. I also need my production clouds where I can run my line of business applications that are critical to the business and should never go down. All integrated with line of business. Now, when we look at hosting service providers, what are they asking us for? One, they want to win more enterprise business. So they're also attracting the enterprise, but they want to provide that value add, that external cloud to the enterprise. They're looking at